As Erica said, I'm Michelle Hirsch. I'm with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in Region 5 in Chicago. Most people don't even know what the regions are unless you have some specific reason to interact with them. And so what I wanted to talk to you about were some of the things that I'm working on and some of the things that over the course of my career have emerged as what I think critically important issues in women and girls' health, but we all know that what affects women and girls impacts our whole community. And my career trajectory really changed here in Indianapolis. I've been with Health and Human Services for about 22 years, and back early on, very early on, I was doing a site visit here with the Indiana Department of Health and was meeting with Maureen McLean, a very sage public health nurse. I call her the patron saint of incarcerated women, extraordinary individual. And what Maureen said is, hey, Michelle, you want to see where real women's health needs to focus? And I said, absolutely. And she said, let's hop in the car, we're going to prison. I said, all right, I trusted Maureen. I said, let's go. And what I learned there is that, I was young in my career. This was 22 years ago, roughly, 20-some years ago. And what I realized, it was a huge eye-opener. Incarcerated women was not on my radar very much, right? And what I found having that very tremendously valuable opportunity was to talk to women who were in the prison, talk to the people who ran the prison and the programs. And at that point, it was one of the most progressive women's prisons in the country, believe it or not, not because of funding, but sheer will and programming on the part of a bunch of the leaders there. And so Maureen, through this opportunity, I got to see that everything that's represented health-wise, challenges to health in the general population, is just exponentially represented in the prison. That everything you can imagine, from heart disease, oral health, infectious disease, chronic disease, mental health, you name it, was there. But what was overwhelming to me, what really changed the trajectory for me, was looking at substance use and abuse. And that substances were involved in many of the crimes that were committed. And that was about the time of the war on drugs, which many call a war on women, because so many women ended up being incarcerated because they couldn't plea bargain, because they were the lowest person on the totem pole. They had really no information to give up on people higher up, so they ended up doing time. Also, women end up incarcerated for reasons related to survival, writing bad checks, doing things that, just for survival and to sustain themselves and, very importantly, their families. And so that was huge. But when I started what really was the eye-opener was that as I talked to women and most importantly the women, but certainly the people who ran the programs, the issue of trauma, the underlying trauma was what was just stunning. And so that really made me commit to doing some work on incarcerated women, trying to have gender-responsive, trauma-informed programming in prisons. And then also, I figured I'd take it beyond that scope, because if we can look at trauma, maybe less women will get incarcerated. I hope that happens in my career, and I think I'll probably just keep working until I see some movement in that direction. That is not at all what I came here to talk about, was incarceration, although it's part of it. Let's do a quick show of hands. Community health workers. Do we have any community health workers? A few. Outstanding. Had a great conversation with Indiana State Department of Health yesterday about community health workers. I love community health workers. How about those of you who do direct clinical care as far as physicians, nurses, PAs? Okay. And social workers? Okay. Fabulous women from the community who are just really interested in learning? Right on. Okay, good. I just like to get a sense of who people are. What have I missed? There's lots of key groups, but shout out a couple of others, who you represent and, why you're here. Anyone? Any group I didn't cover, I'm sure. What? One more time. Community outreach. Okay. Advocacy. Excellent. You're all the people we need. I'm sorry? Oh, beautiful. Okay, great. Thank you. Terrific. What a diverse crowd. I think this is what a fabulous opportunity. So, what I want to talk about is, or what I want to start with is talking about where we stand. You know, if you want to know where you're going, you got to know where you are, right? You know, otherwise any direction is fine. And so I started by looking at some of the stats in preparation for this talk. I looked at the most recent stats for rankings, and Tisha had mentioned that you went from an F to a D. I call that solid improvement, okay? And next year, I'm eager to hear that you've gone up to a C or maybe even a B. So I looked at the America's Health rankings, and that they recently put out a report, and it's an excellent report if you haven't seen it, on the health of women and children. And you'll forgive me, I typically have my notes in front of me, but the computer's down there, so if I occasionally glance like that, you'll have to forgive me. And as women, we're always flexible. I didn't have my the glasses I had were for a computer screen here, and then I tried my other ones. I'm like, no, that's not going to work. So I'm improvising. So if every now and then I have to squint, you'll know what I'm up to. But we're all in this together, and so I hope you'll be patient with me. So anyway, I looked at this America's Health rankings, the report on women and children, and I think we're all in agreement about this, but promoting the health of women, infants, and children is fundamental to keeping our communities and our nation healthy. I'll buy that, yeah? Okay. Well, good. So just quickly, because I'll move through some slides very quickly just to give you a flavor. And Tisha, will people get the slides at the end if they want them? Okay, terrific. So for 29 years, they've been doing this health ranking. They look at 62 indicators, which include individual, community, environmental. The key findings nationally for this most recent one is some progress has been made nationally, encouraging declines in tobacco use. Some progress has been made about access issues for women and decreased in teen births. Some of the challenges, though, are mortality related to disparities in mortality, increased drug deaths for women 15 to 44, increased suicides for girls 15 to 19, maternal mortality, differences, as I mentioned, and some wide variation among the states. So some states are doing really well and others are struggling. And so looking at the policy and practices, that's what this is designed for, is to have a place for advocacy. A woman up at the front, you were talking about being an advocate. And so you can use this information and say, look, this is where the national stats are, and this is where we are in Indiana. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to call you out. I'm keeping you on your toes. So, some other highlights were that drug deaths have increased nationally, that children in poverty have decreased. That's outstanding. And that excessive drinking has increased and air pollution decreased, prenatal death has increased. And I'm going through these quickly because you'll get the slides. If you want the stats, you can always you can always go back and look at the report. I'm just trying to lay a groundwork of where we're starting from. And heart disease, as Dr. Box at the Indiana Health Department, Department of Health told me yesterday, it remains the leading cause of death for Indiana women. Maternal mortality is also a huge challenge for the state. With respect to rankings, yeah, Indiana's not doing so well nationally. I think this most recent report, it was at 35 or 36. That only says to me opportunity. So there's lots to do and lots of great folks to do it. So you can look at some of the rankings, and you know, the beauty of a gathering like this is that each of you are looking at a different part of the puzzle, right? So you're all bringing this part of the puzzle, and you can't tell what the whole puzzle is until you come together and start putting it together with the other pieces, and then, you know, your image emerges. So the challenge at the federal level is that we provide funding, Health and Human Services and all the departments provide funding. We provide funding typically in silos. We're not particularly good at the collaboration and the coordination of all those. So it's incumbent upon everybody at the community, at the state, at the local level, to figure out who your partners are. And if you're, for example, needing to increase residential recovery services for women in the community, you find out who else is getting money, maybe from a different program, funding stream, even department. I've recently found out the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who'd have thought, right? They provide all sorts of funding. So if you're not used to looking there for funds, check it out. They have a lot of infrastructure grants. They have all sorts of things that may be of value to you. So I'm delighted that it's a diverse audience this morning in terms of all of your different backgrounds. Talk to each other. It's all about meeting the unusual suspects. You know, we all sit with people we know. I encourage you to go and talk to somebody else that you've never met, ask them what they do, and ask them one key thing that they think could help improve the health of women and girls in the state and across in your communities. So in Indiana, some of the strengths, you've got a lot of resilience capacity. Kids aren't missing school, there's supportive neighborhoods, and apparently substance use and dependence among adolescents is decreasing. That's a great thing. Challenges are, again, high maternal mortality, a lot of smoking, as Dr. Box also mentioned and probably will mention at lunch, and high neonatal mortality rates. So I like to look at root causes. You know, we can continue to provide, you know, who watches TV and sees all of these drug ads, right? Now, drugs are essentially important. There are things that we could not do without pharmaceuticals, and we're living healthier, better lives because of some very remarkable treatments. However, you see one treatment after the next, after the next, after the next, and you go, wow, maybe we could look upstream. So I have committed to my career is focusing on what's really going on. We know all this ill health and poor mental health and challenges and toxic stress, what's going on at the ground level. And so I like to look at the root causes. I like to go upstream, as your amazing former Commissioner of Health, Dr. Jerome Adams, now our Surgeon General. Your loss is our gain. We're really happy about him being in DC. And he's a remarkable individual, as you all well know. But so looking at root causes, health develops over a lifetime. It's not just a one-shot deal. It's not a pinpoint in time. Our health now may have been predicted by some of the things that impacted us even prenatally. So even before we took our first breath, there are things that may have been at work impacting our health. That is not at all to say that our health is determined at birth. No, absolutely not. We never say that predictive factors are necessarily going to determine our course for our health because of all sorts of protective factors. And I see a couple hundred protective factors right here in the room. All of you are working to change the trajectory of somebody's health towards the positive, and for that I thank you. The next minute or two, I'm going to just quickly run through some of the things just to lay the groundwork. We have a lot of trauma in our society, not surprising, but what was surprising when I started doing this and when I talked to groups is just how much trauma there really is, right? So we know about intimate partner violence. We know that 1 in 3 women will be involved in a violent relationship during the course of their lives, and that men who grow up in violent homes are twice as likely to be violent with their partners later. And also women are more likely to stay in abusive relationships if they grew up in that setting. That's what they're familiar with. That's what they know. May not even know that healthier relationships are an option. May feel comfortable in a relationship that's got a little more edge to it because that's what's familiar. Rape and sexual assault, and I promise we'll get through some of these really dark statistics and move on towards something bigger. But again, we need to know where we are. So rape and sexual assault, 1 of every 5 or 6 women, this stat says 6, but I've heard recently that it's closer to 5. 1 in every 5 women will be the victim of a rape or attempted rape in her lifetime. And so that's about 18 million American women, and it's probably closer to 20 some now. Child abuse and neglect, we have one of the worst records internationally about child abuse and neglect. Child sexual abuse, by the time a girl is 13, 1 in 5 will have suffered sexual assault, and 1 in 10 boys will be sexually abused by somebody who very likely is somebody who's charged with caring for them and that they're supposed to trust. Toxic stress, stress in and of itself is good. Got me up this morning, even though I'm on Central Time. Got me to the coffee bar to get some coffee. Got me over here. That's good stress. That's a positive stress. Then there's a tolerable stress. That's a stress when you may be working in an environment and there might be a challenging situation, whether it's leadership or management, or it may be budget issues, or it may be a long commute. But those Tolerable stresses get buffered because of the people around us, right? How many of us have talked to, someone we work with to kind of complain, and it's that community that gives us that strength to keep moving. So that's tolerable stress. It's the stress we all have, and it's not bad, it just is, but it's buffered. The stress that I'm talking about that's really traumatic is toxic stress. It's those environmental factors, either environmental or an illness or a family situation that has no buffer. It is just a perpetual stress. It's prolonged activation of our stress response system, and that's what takes a toll on us. So when we're talking about trauma, I just want to get us all on the same page. When I'm talking about trauma, and when most people who are in this field are talking about trauma, some people say, oh, trauma, like car accidents and gunshots. Yes, but we're also talking about a lot of the experiential trauma, including things that overwhelm our ability to cope. They're external threats that overwhelm our internal ability to cope. And frankly, everyone's had them. Everyone has had something that has been traumatic at one point or another, where it just kind of threw you off kilter. You had to take a step back for a minute. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, that's why we call it SAMHSA, because it's really hard to say fast. SAMHSA provides a nice definition of trauma as including 3 E's. There's an event, there's the experience of the event, and then there's an effect. So for example, yesterday was September 11th. For me, I was on the September 11th that we commemorate. I was at home watching TV and watching this happen, and saw this happening on TV. And so I had that event, there was that event, I had my experience of it, and the effect was very different than my colleague who worked in New York and was on the subway going to work, and her building was just a block or so away from the World Trade Center. Her experience was very different. So mine was clearly stressful and disturbing. Hers was truly traumatic. I worried for a while if she'd ever be the same, and probably she never will be the same, but she's also let it change her in ways that were driving and passionate and motivating for her. So when you're thinking about trauma, it's not the same for everybody, right? And I used to always say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, except when it doesn't, all right? Sometimes what doesn't kill you is gonna try to kill you down the road, you know what I mean? So it's important to make that distinction that, yeah, this chronic perpetual stress, we call it allostatic load. It's, amplifying the body's system to respond to stress, can be really toxic, but it doesn't have to be. So just after I brought you down, with all those bummer slides first thing in the morning, yeah, thank you, Michelle, I'm sure you all really appreciate that. I just want to wrap that up and move on by saying that trauma and violence occur at epidemic rates in our society. And of that, we need to be really aware. We can't pretend that everybody's living without a pretty serious stress load, traumatic load in their lives. And when we think of root causes, we need to really be cognizant of early traumatic stress, and that it is scientifically demonstrated to be a powerful influence on health. How many of you heard about the ACE study? Okay, this will be key to you. This changed my life. When I first heard about it, was shortly after Maureen took me to the women's prison. I was at a conference and I heard Vince Felitti talk about the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. I thought this was when I heard the results, I couldn't believe it. It was so stunning. This relationship, how prevalent trauma is in all different forms. And that this study really demonstrated that there's a huge relationship between traumatic exposure and subsequent health outcomes, health and wellness issues. And so I thought that the next day I'd wake up, I'd see the New York Times, I think it was in Boston, the Boston Globe, whatever, the Washington Post, and it would be headlines, front page news. Nothing. Crickets. It's like, what is going on? This guy is cured cancer essentially. And it was unfathomable to me why nobody was talking about this. And so I started thinking about it and started talking to people, and there were a variety of reasons. Nobody was talking about it then because it didn't fall neatly into anyone's backyard. It's too big of a bite to take and be able to chew and digest. For healthcare providers, you've got such limited time. For mental health people, there weren't clearer ways to address trauma. So really nobody was starting to do anything about it, and so it really didn't gain much traction. But let me tell you, just spend a couple minutes on the ACE study. This is something you should look up. The adverse childhood, was somebody at the back trying to get my attention, or no? No, okay. I thought somebody was waving to me. Hi. Anyway, so the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, it was a study done with coordination of CDC and Kaiser Permanente. There were 17,000 individuals, so we know it had a lot of strength. It looked at 10 different very common, and I wish I had more time. I'd love to tell you about the history of the study, which was really fascinating, because they stumbled upon it, just like Post-it notes, you know? I mean, sometimes you're setting out to do one thing, and it takes you off course, and that course is so important that you kind of detoured. So anyway, it looked at 10 of the common causes of individuals like childhood trauma. And those included abuse, so sexual abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse in the home, neglect, emotional and physical neglect, and household dysfunction, including alcoholism or drug abuse in the home, loss of a biological parent, and depression or mental illness that's untreated, and a mother who's treated violently, and imprisonment of a household member. So with the people you're working with, they may have a pretty, all of us, right? But think about the people you work with, because I never ask people to think about themselves in this context, but think about the people with whom you work. Those are pretty common. They're pretty awful, but they're pretty common, right? And so we need to understand that this kind of prevalence of traumatic exposure is very, very common. And so I am going the wrong direction. That was bad. Okay, so if you look at this, here's what they found, 17,000 individuals. They found that about 33% of the population had about scored 1 on an ACE score. You'll probably hear a lot about ACEs and ACE screening and things like that. This is what they're talking about. Get a chance and read more about the study, because I don't have the luxury of going into depth about it right now with time. About 26%, a little over a quarter, experienced 2 ACEs. And keep in mind, those were only 10. Not to say there aren't literally thousands of an unlimited number of other traumatic things that can be traumatic for an individual, but these were the common ones. About 16% had 2 ACEs. I'm sorry, I totally botched that. 33% had no ACEs, okay? They were fortunate enough to have avoided that. 26% had 1, 16% had 2, about 10% had 3, and at an ACE score of 4, which is really where you start to see the dramatic impact on health, they're about 16%. So if you look at ACE score of 3 and 4, that's about 17% of the population have a pretty serious, pretty substantial trauma history, right? So what does that mean? When we think about the ACE study, those were 10 limited things. There was another study subsequent to that looked at the impact of growing up in violent or urban areas. And that was the Philadelphia Urban ACE study. And I'll just put this up here so you'll get the slides if you're interested, and you can read a little bit more. But it showed the huge amount of trauma that these individuals faced. So in the prior study, remember, it was about 27% had an ACE score of 3 or more. In this study, it was closer to 37%. I'm sorry. 37% had a much higher ACE score. And the stats don't matter. It's the issues at hand. And so you see, not only did they have more ACEs, but they had, in each category, there was a lot more emotional abuse, physical abuse, but also took into account things that were going on in their community. And so this was an outgrowth of the ACE study, looking at what's going on and what it's like to live in some urban areas. So what I'm trying to get at, and I think I've probably driven this point home, is that exposure to adverse experiences are identified as being one of the greatest threats to our nation's health. And you think, well, how can that be? Well, when you think about it, 8 of the 10 leading causes of death, and this is the CDC said this, is that 8 of the 10 leading causes of death can be directly linked back to early traumatic exposure, as well as 40 other health conditions. What other thing is like that? I mean, if you look at asbestos or smoking or any of those things, yeah, they've got some profound health consequences. But this early traumatic exposure and what it does to our brains and our bodies, and that's not to say it's a death sentence, no way. It's just that we need to be aware because this is what's going on with most of the people with whom we work. So remember I said that an ACE score of 4 or more is where you really start to see the increase in death or with disability and chronic diseases, acute conditions, mental health, oral health, you name it. I'm just going to run through a few of the slides because I think they're fascinating. And what I'm really trying to get across is, doesn't matter what the issue is, when you get an ACE score of 4 on these charts, you really see a dramatic increase in the prevalence of these particular challenges. So depression, this one breaks it out by men and women, but with an ACE score of 4, you've got a huge increase in depression. Suicide attempts, same thing. Smoking, teen sexual behaviors, a variety of different markers. Heart disease, adult alcoholism, intravenous drug use. And with the opioid epidemic, we know that that is a very serious issue. When they did the ACE work, they found that if with a male with an ACE score of 6 or more, they had a 4,600% increased risk of becoming an IV drug user. I mean, you don't get it. Wow is right. I mean, they reran a lot of the statistics in the ACE study because they just couldn't believe that they were consistently getting these values that you might see as a statistician once in a career. They were getting them consistently and on all these particular variables. This study's been replicated over and over and over, and so it holds up. The results are consistent. They vary a little bit in one respect or another depending on the geography of where someone lives. It cuts across economic and class. It isn't limited to just people who live in poverty. It's across the whole cross section of the U.S. to one degree or another. So it's just something to kind of tuck in the back of your brain. So this is the ACE pyramid. You've probably seen this. If you haven't, you will. It describes this progression of if you have exposure to these traumatic events, starting with the purple, not the blue. I'll come back and comment on the blue part of the pyramid, the foundation. But with these adverse childhood experiences, for example, I just use this as a quick case study. Young girl, she's at home. She's at school, but the night before, she heard her mother being beaten by an intimate partner, which we know from the statistics is fairly common, right? So the mom has told the girl to keep her safe. Go in your room, lock the door, do not come out no matter what. She hears her mother being abused in a fight, and she's scared. By the grace of God, somehow she gets to school the next morning. What's her teacher going to see? Somebody who's bright and well-rested and had a good breakfast and is ready to learn, is sitting in the front row? No, she's very likely going to see somebody who's withdrawn, understandably, scared, concerned, distracted. She's in her primal brain of just survival. Like, how do I get through this day? I'm so worried about my mom, right? So then what's that going to do? Socially, emotionally, cognitively, that's going to have an impact, right? I mean, how could it not? When she goes out at lunch and hangs out with her friends, she's not going to be wanting to talk about the most recent song that came out or what's going on Friday night. She's distracted, right? But that's not what people are seeing. They're not going to look at her and say, oh, she must have had a traumatic night. There must have been something that's really bothering her. They're going to think, oh, as a teacher, she was up late, she's distracted, she doesn't care, whatever, right? So we make all these judgments, we make all these assumptions, but what trauma-informed approach, being trauma-informed means you kind of peel back the layer of the onion and you presume that something may be going on. You don't need to know exactly what it is. You don't need to get in somebody's business like that, but you need to know that there may be other things at work that we're not aware of. So that experience changes social, emotional, cognitive. What does that do? We all cope, right? What do? We don't feel good. We eat, we drink, we smoke, we have risky sex, do drugs. There are all sorts of things. There are also a lot of healthy coping mechanisms, and that's what I encourage everybody to really explore what your best coping mechanism is. But then, a lot of the unhealthy ones lead to health concerns, such as chronic and acute conditions, as far as risk and other risky behaviors. which of course leads to, it can lead to disease and disability. And ultimately, if you have an ACE score of 6 or more, statistically, and this isn't to the person because there's always things that can take you off that negative track, 20 years earlier death rate for somebody who's got an ACE score of 6 or more. That is not a death sentence because we know that there are protective factors and resilience. And when I talk about this, it's really hard because I want all of you to take care of yourselves, because statistically speaking, many of us in the room have had some of these experiences. And so at any point, take care of yourself first and foremost. Check out. If this is challenging to hear, come back, look at the slides later or not. But do take care of yourselves first and foremost, because how can we be effective in helping everybody else that we need to if we're not taking care of ourselves first? So the ACE study, just to drive it home, summarize, participants who experienced 3 or more adverse childhood experience had much higher rates of substance abuse, domestic violence, suicide attempts, and were more likely to drop out of school, be divorced, have diabetes, be obese, have cancer, and experience heart disease. So we know that there's a very strong correlation between early trauma and substance use as an adult. And I love these oil slicks. These are so cool. I'm borrowing this from Laura Porter, who works with ACE Interface. Some of you may be familiar with the ACE Interface. They do ACE Master Trainers. And I think there's an active group in Indiana. They go out and they do training. So if you're interested in having your group trained on ACEs and adverse childhood experiences and resilience, which is what they're getting at, which is what we're all getting at. We're looking to identify the issues, look at the root causes, and move forward with upstream approaches to address them. So look at all the different things that are impacted. So the oil slick in the middle are the ACEs. And so how much of all of that, all those challenges and ill health are accounted for by having exposure to ACEs? It's pretty stunning. I mean, what is it? See, again, here my glasses situation. Here's my squinting. 75% of IV drug use, 67% of suicide attempts. And you just kind of go around. Painkillers, use of painkillers to get high. I mean, 50-some%. It's pretty stunning. What if we were able to mitigate some of that trauma? How much healthier would all of us be? So just a quick little light physiology. I know I'm running out of time. So I'll skip this, I'll skip some of this, or I'll go through it quickly. When we get scared, when we step out in the street and didn't see the car coming, we have this automatic response in the HPA axis. It's fight, flight, or flee, right? And that's useful because we need to jump out of the way of that speeding car. And long ago, you needed to run away from the bear that might be chasing you. And so it's a great system. It's our very primal brain, but when that part of your brain is working, the rest of it, really the ability to think and executive function gets turned off. So have you ever talked to somebody who was just so stressed out that they couldn't access their thinking brain? That's what happens when you're chronically exposed to trauma. So you may think that somebody's just not paying attention. No, they just are not in a place that they can. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to help figure out how we can get the people to that place. So more about the neurophysiology of trauma, but it's pretty impressive. Not one single body system isn't impacted by exposure to traumatic stress or heightened stress, toxic stress, the like. We know that chronic exposure to stress impacts our ability to learn, our memory. It involves reward and reinforcement and the like, and regulates our hormones. I will move through. If you think about people in your practice or that you see in your setting, they're like an iceberg, right? You only see part of it. You don't really know what else is going on. But if you're not trauma informed, you're going to run into that iceberg and cause problems, both for you and for those you're working with. And so when we talk about trauma informed approaches, it's important to know that our actions, policies, and words have the ability to hurt or heal. And that everybody in the organization needs to have a basic understanding of trauma and provide care so people can maximize the benefit of your services. Here are a few basics. Take the trauma into account, avoid triggering trauma reactions, adjust behavior to accommodate your patients, and allow survivors to manage their stress. Am I getting the hook? I am. Okay, I thought so. I saw her moving, so I better move through this quickly. You'll get the slides. Take a look at them. Here's the take-home message. It's a paradigm shift from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Think about how you look at somebody if they're smoking, they've got emphysema, and they're still smoking, and you're providing clinical care, and you go, what's wrong with you? You got to stop smoking. They didn't choose to do something that's going to harm them. They're just trying to cope. And so if you can understand why someone's doing something, you can work towards harm reduction. Surgeon General says we got to look upstream. I completely agree. The science supports that we can prevent addiction. There are great evidence-based practices such as home visiting nurse partnership, positive parenting. A colleague of mine and I did this work on trauma-informed approach to care, which is translated into a curriculum for providers that's going to be released in the next couple weeks about trauma-informed approaches, understanding and responding to the effects of trauma throughout the lifespan. They're free, they're online, they're interactive, they've got CE, and they're designed for physicians and healthcare providers. This is what part of the page looks like. Here's some other resources, and I thank you.